There is a moment, deep in the forest, when everything goes quiet. Not the gentle quiet of an empty trail or a still morning. This is a different kind of silence. The kind that presses against your chest. The kind that the birds seem to understand before you do. 1 second the jungle is alive with sound. Insects, hornbills, the distant percussion of rain on broad leaves. And then, as if someone reached up and switched the world off, nothing. Every experienced guide who has ever walked the Bwindi impenetrable forest in southwestern Uganda knows that silence. They have learned to read it the way a sailor reads the color of the sky. It is not peaceful. It is a warning. Something in the undergrowth has decided it is done tolerating your presence, and the forest itself is holding its breath to see what happens next. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to stand 12 feet away from 450 pounds of silverback gorilla as he launches himself in your direction, screaming, beating the earth, snapping branches as thick as a man's forearm like they are made of paper, then stay with us. Because that is exactly what happened to a trekking group on a misty hillside above the Buhoma sector of Bwindi, and the story of how they survived it comes down to a single man who did not run. Before we go into that forest, before we follow those footprints into the mud and the nettles and the cathedral dark beneath the canopy, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we tell here is built on moments just like this one. Moments where human beings stood at the edge of something enormous and had to decide in a fraction of a second who they were. You do not want to miss what comes next. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Uganda sits on the equator, straddled across the western arm of the Great Rift Valley, and it is one of the most biologically extraordinary places on the planet. The southwestern corner of the country, where the borders of Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo meet in a tangle of volcanic ridges and ancient forest, is home to roughly half of all the mountain gorillas left on Earth. The other half live in the nearby Virunga Massif, a chain of volcanoes shared between those same three nations. Combined, the total world population of gorilla, Beringe, hovers somewhere around 1,000 individuals, give or take the surveys. 1,000 animals. That is fewer than the number of people who might watch a minor league baseball game on a slow Tuesday evening. That number is both a cause for cautious celebration and a reminder of how close to the edge this species continues to walk. Decades of civil conflict, habitat destruction, poaching, and disease pushed mountain gorillas to the brink of extinction within living memory. Conservation efforts, many of them anchored in the revenue generated by controlled gorilla trekking permits, have helped stabilize the population. The permits are expensive by design. Only a limited number of visitors are allowed to approach any given gorilla family on any given day, and visits are capped at 1 hour, with strict rules about distance, noise, and what to do if things go wrong. The rules exist because these animals are wild. Whatever gentleness you may have seen in documentary footage, a silverback tolerating a toddler climbing on his back, a young gorilla peering into a camera with enormous amber eyes, do not mistake that tolerance for submission. A mountain gorilla is not a large, slow-moving animal. It is not a gentle giant in the way that phrase is typically deployed. It is one of the most powerful creatures on Earth, capable of generating forces that dwarf anything a human being can produce, and it lives by a social code that is absolute and uncompromising. Within that code, the display charge is one of the most important tools in a silverback's arsenal, and understanding what it is and what it is not is the difference between survival and catastrophe. The family at the center of this story is known to the guides and researchers who track them as Rushagura. It is one of several habituated gorilla families that operate within the Bwindi Impenetrable National Park, and it has been monitored by Uganda Wildlife Authority rangers and trackers for years. Habituation is the process by which wild gorillas are gradually accustomed to the presence of human beings. It takes years of patient, non-threatening contact. Rangers approach the family daily, always keeping a respectful distance, always behaving in a way that signals they are not a threat, always reading the gorilla's responses and adjusting accordingly. It is slow, painstaking work, and even when it is considered complete, habituated does not mean domesticated. These animals remain entirely wild in their behavior, their instincts, their capacity for violence. The dominant male of Rushagura, the silverback, is a massive animal. Silverbacks earn their name from the saddle of silver-gray hair that develops across their backs as they reach sexual maturity, typically somewhere around 12 to 13 years of age. A fully adult male mountain gorilla is built in a way that is genuinely difficult to appreciate from a photograph. The breadth of the shoulders, the thickness of the neck, the sheer architectural density of the chest. These animals are not just large. They are constructed differently than anything you have likely encountered in person. The sagittal crest, that bony ridge running along the top of the skull, anchors jaw muscles powerful enough to crack open dense forest vegetation that no human tool could easily manage. The arms are long and extraordinarily strong. The hands are massive. When a silverback stands upright, which they do more often than most people expect, the effect is startling. The morning of the incident began the way most trekking days begin. The group assembled at the park headquarters before sunrise, stamping their feet in the cool highland air, checking their gear, trying to manage the complicated cocktail of excitement and anxiety that every first-time trekker experiences. Bwindi sits at elevation. The forest is dense, humid, and steep, in ways that reward neither the complacent nor the underprepared. Mud is a constant companion. Nettles reach out from the undergrowth and find any exposed skin with what seems like personal intent. Tree roots twist across the trail, invisible beneath the leaf litter, waiting to catch a boot at exactly the wrong moment. The group that morning was a mixed party of 8 visitors, a couple from Germany who had been planning the trip for 3 years, a wildlife photographer from South Africa who had been to Bwindi twice before, a family group from the United States with their teenage daughter, and a solo traveler from Japan who spoke very little English but whose face communicated everything clearly enough when it needed to. They were led by a team of 3 rangers and 2 guides. The lead guide, let us call him by the name his colleagues use, Moses, had been working these forests for nearly 14 years. He knew the Rushigura family the way a good teacher knows a difficult classroom. He knew their habits, their temperaments, their moods. He knew which individuals to watch, which juveniles were going through phases of heightened curiosity, where the family liked to move in different weather conditions, how to read the subtle behavioral signals that broadcast what was coming before it arrived. The trackers had gone ahead at first light, following the trail left by the gorilla family from where they had last been seen the evening before. Gorillas build fresh sleeping nests every night, constructing rough platforms of bent and folded vegetation in trees or on the ground, and a family group leaves a trail of evidence that is not difficult to follow for those trained to read it. Crushed vegetation, dung, the stripped remnants of food plants, the characteristic smell that experienced trackers describe as something between musk and damp earth, and something else that has no other reference point in ordinary life. By mid-morning, the group had been walking for almost 2 hours. The terrain had grown steeper, the vegetation thicker. The light that filtered through the canopy was gray-green and diffuse, as if the forest were generating its own atmosphere. Moses moved at the front, machete in hand for the occasional obstruction, radio crackling softly at his hip. The tracker's message had come through 20 minutes earlier. The family was close, maybe 400 meters ahead, moving slowly, feeding. They found them in a small depression between 2 ridgelines, where the forest floor opened slightly, and a profusion of wild celery and other vegetation created something close to a natural clearing. Gorillas were everywhere, or at least, that was the initial impression. The chaotic, overwhelming sensory immersion of suddenly being inside a group of large primates going about their morning. A young female sat against the base of a tree, nursing an infant. 2 juveniles chased each other through the undergrowth, in a game whose rules were clearly understood only by them. A mid-ranking male, a blackback, younger than a silverback, with none of the silver but all of the muscle, sat watching the newcomers with the particular expression that gorillas sometimes adopt, the one that looks disconcertingly like assessment. An older female sat near the edge of the clearing, methodically dismantling a stalk of vegetation and consuming it section by section. The silverback was not immediately visible, which Moses noted. He had already raised one hand, the signal for the group to stop and compress into a tight cluster, keeping low, keeping quiet, avoiding direct eye contact with any of the animals. He positioned himself at the front left of the group, between the visitors and the direction from which the silverback sounds were audible, because he could hear him. A low, rhythmic vocalization, not aggressive, not yet, but the kind of sound that establishes presence, that says, I am here, and I am aware of everything that is happening in my home. Then the silverback appeared. He came around the side of a large tree, moving slowly, his knuckles pressing into the soft earth with the weight of someone completely certain of their place in the order of things. He was enormous. Even for a silverback, which carries an evolutionary inheritance of extreme size in the male line, this animal was physically commanding in a way that bypassed rational thought entirely. The visitors had been briefed. They had watched videos, read the guidelines, signed the waivers. They had intellectually prepared themselves for this. And still, when he stepped into their line of sight and turned those dark, ancient, intelligent eyes toward the cluster of humans standing at the edge of his world, the preparation dissolved and something older and simpler took over. Several members of the group took an involuntary half-step backward. Moses did not move. The Silverback held his position for a long moment. His eyes moved across the group. Then he looked at Moses. The two of them had met before, in the sense that Moses had spent hundreds of hours in the presence of this family, and this particular male had come to recognize him as a consistent, non-threatening presence. Whether that recognition constituted anything like trust is a question that behavioral scientists debate. What it meant in practical terms was that Moses had a history with this animal, a context, and that context mattered. What happened next happened fast. One of the juveniles, the bolder of the two that had been chasing each other through the undergrowth, came careening out of the vegetation and stopped almost directly at the feet of one of the American visitors. The visitor, the father of the family group, gasped audibly and stepped backward, colliding with his daughter, which caused her to stumble and grab his arm, which created a burst of sudden movement and noise at exactly the wrong moment. The Silverback's response was instantaneous. He vocalized, not the low chest resonating rumble of the previous minutes, but something categorically different. A sharp, explosive roar that seemed to come from somewhere below the chest, from somewhere deeper and more primal than ordinary anatomy accounts for. And then he charged. A silverback gorilla in full charge covers ground with terrifying speed. The body that looks slow and heavy when moving through normal daily activity reveals itself, in moments like this, as a machine designed for explosive force. He came through the undergrowth, breaking branches, screaming, the silver of his back catching the filtered light of the forest as he closed the distance between himself and the cluster of humans, in what seemed, to everyone watching, like no time at all. The group did what most human beings would do. They flinched, they compressed. The German couple ducked. The photographer, to his credit, had his camera up by instinct, but his finger did not press the shutter. He later said he had no conscious thought at that moment, only the camera in his hands, and the world going very loud. The American daughter, standing behind her father, made a sound that she would later describe as not screaming, but which everyone else who was there would describe differently. The solo traveler from Japan stood completely still, which may have been shock, or may have been the most sensible response in the clearing. Moses stood his ground. He did not step forward, he did not shout, he did not wave his arms or attempt to physically intervene in any way. He did what his years in that forest had taught him to do. He kept his body low, non-threatening, presenting as small a profile as possible, while simultaneously not retreating. He averted his eyes, not fully away, but downward and slightly to the side, the posture that in guerrilla social language signals submission without flight. He spoke, quietly. Not to the group behind him, not in English or German or Japanese. He spoke in the sounds that experienced guides learn to use, low vocalizations that sit somewhere in the register of the gorilla's own communication, sounds that say, I am not a threat, I am not running, I accept your authority here. The silverback stopped. He was close enough that Moses could have reached out and touched him, close enough that the group behind Moses could smell him, that complex, dense, animal smell that no description in a guidebook adequately prepares you for. The silverback stood, chest heaving, eyes moving across the group. Then he made a single, low sound, and he turned and walked back into the forest. It was over. The entire encounter, from the first charge to the moment the silverback disappeared, lasted approximately 9 seconds. For every person in that clearing, it felt considerably longer. The guide turned to his group. He checked on each of them. He gave them a moment to breathe, to let the adrenaline begin its slow retreat, to find the ground beneath their feet again. Then he quietly explained what had happened, what the charge was, what it meant, and what his response had been. He was calm, unhurried, precise. The wildlife photographer later said that listening to Moses explain the encounter in the immediate aftermath was one of the most remarkable things he had ever experienced. The man's voice was completely steady, as if he were describing something he had watched happen to someone else from a comfortable distance. This is the thing about bluff charges, and it is important to understand them clearly, because the word bluff carries connotations that are dangerously misleading if you have never experienced one. A silverback gorilla does not charge because he wants to eat you. Gorillas are predominantly herbivores. Mountain gorillas feed on a range of vegetation: leaves, stems, bark, roots, wild celery, bamboo shoots, and small amounts of insects or other invertebrates when they encounter them, but they are not predators and they do not perceive humans as prey. The charge is not an expression of hunger, it is an expression of authority. A silverback is responsible for his family. That is not a romantic projection, it is the biological reality of his social role. The family group depends on him for protection against rival males, against predators, against anything that represents a potential threat to the females and juveniles under his protection. When something disturbs the equilibrium of the group, an unexpected noise, a sudden movement, the presence of an unfamiliar element in an area he considers his, the silverback has a responsibility to respond. The bluff charge is often the first line of that response. It is designed to intimidate, to establish dominance, to communicate that the intruder needs to recognize the hierarchy immediately. If the intruder is appropriately intimidated, if they submit, lower themselves, demonstrate that they are not a challenge, the charge frequently ends exactly as this one did. The silverback reasserts his authority and returns to his family. The danger enters the equation when the intruder does the wrong thing. Running triggers pursuit. It is a simple, ancient mechanism, and it operates in the gorilla as it operates in many predators and territorial animals across the natural world. An animal that runs is an animal that is fleeing, and an animal that is fleeing has placed itself in a very different relational category than one that holds its ground. Running does not communicate submission. It communicates panic, and panic can trigger escalation. A charge that might have ended in a display stops becomes a chase, and a chase, with a 450-pound silverback involved, does not end in ways that anyone wants to contemplate. Similarly, making direct eye contact, raising yourself to full height, making sudden aggressive movements or loud sounds, any of these responses can be interpreted as a challenge rather than submission, and a silverback who reads a challenge will respond to a challenge. These are not animals that back down from challenges. The social structure of a gorilla family is built on the premise that the dominant male has established and will defend his dominance. A challenge to that is met accordingly. Moses had spent 14 years learning the difference between the responses that de-escalate and the responses that do the opposite. He had built that knowledge through hundreds of hours in the forest, through training, through study, through the kind of accumulated experience that cannot be gained any other way. And when the moment arrived, the 9 seconds that defined the entire encounter, that knowledge was the only thing standing between his group and a very different outcome. This is not to say that standing your ground is always the right response in every encounter with a wild animal. Context matters enormously. The species matters. The individual animal matters. The circumstances matter. What works in one situation fails catastrophically in another, and the value of a trained, experienced guide is precisely that they carry the judgment to read the specific situation in real time and respond accordingly. Moses did not stand his ground because he was fearless. He stood his ground because he understood what he was looking at. He knew this family. He knew this male. He had read the charge correctly as a display rather than a full attack, and he responded in the way most likely to de-escalate it. That assessment required expertise, experience, and an enormous amount of calm under conditions that produce the opposite in most human nervous systems. The Rushagura family did not leave the area after the encounter. Within minutes of the silverback's retreat into the vegetation, the group was able to continue their observation from the respectful distance that the guides re-established. The juveniles returned to their game. The nursing female continued nursing. The older female resumed her methodical consumption of vegetation. The silverback reappeared at the far edge of the clearing and sat, in the way that large, confident animals sit, with complete authority and zero urgency, watching everything and concerned about nothing. The group spent the remainder of their hour in the forest, in a state that several of them later described as the most heightened, most alive, most present they had ever felt. The German couple, who had planned the trip for 3 years, said afterward that they could not have imagined, in all that planning and all that anticipation, that it would feel like this. The wildlife photographer, who had spent years in the field in some of the most wildlife-rich environments on Earth, said that the 9 seconds of the charge and the subsequent quiet of the observation were the most significant wildlife experience of his career. The American teenager, who had stumbled and grabbed her father's arm and made the sound that everyone describes differently, said simply that she would never forget Moses's face during the charge. How still it was. How completely, impossibly still. Mountain gorillas exist in a world that we have been systematically dismantling for over a century. The forests of Central Africa have been logged, burned, converted to agricultural land, and torn apart by human conflict on a scale that defies easy comprehension. The gorillas that survived did so by retreating deeper into increasingly fragmented habitat, and even that retreat has been a losing proposition for most of the past 100 years. The mountain gorilla's range is brutally constrained. They exist at high elevation, in forests that occupy a relatively small combined area, hemmed in on all sides by human settlement, agricultural land, and the political borders of nations that have not always cooperated effectively on conservation. Unlike lowland gorilla subspecies, which have somewhat larger ranges to retreat into, the mountain gorilla has nowhere else to go. The forest that remains is the forest they have. When it shrinks, they shrink with it. The story of their recovery, and it is a recovery, however partial, however fragile, is one of the more remarkable conservation narratives of recent decades. In the 1980s, the mountain gorilla population was estimated at somewhere around 250 to 300 individuals. The prognosis was not good. The combination of habitat loss, poaching, and political instability in the region made anything resembling optimism difficult to sustain. And yet the population has grown. Not dramatically, not swiftly, but measurably, persistently, in the face of continued pressures. Several factors contributed to this. Anti-poaching efforts intensified. Transboundary conservation cooperation between Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC improved, though it has never been without complications. Veterinary intervention, treating sick or injured gorillas, managing disease outbreaks, became more sophisticated. And gorilla trekking tourism, carefully managed and strictly regulated, created a powerful economic incentive for conservation that functions at the community level. That last point is not incidental. Conservation that exists only on paper or only in the interests of governments and international organizations is conservation that is perpetually vulnerable to the needs of local communities who may have very different and very immediate priorities. When the families living adjacent to the park can make a living from the park's existence, as guides, trackers, lodge employees, craft vendors, transport providers, the park becomes something worth protecting in practical terms, not just philosophical ones. The expensive trekking permits, the revenue from which flows back into local communities through various mechanisms, are part of what makes mountain gorilla conservation financially coherent at the level where it actually has to work. Moses is part of this system. His livelihood, his professional identity, his deep and evident love for the forest and the animals in it, all of this is bound up in the existence of a functioning relationship between the park and the human communities around it. When he stands in the path of a charging silverback and holds his ground, he is not just protecting 8 tourists. He is performing, in the most concentrated and literal way possible, the function that justifies the entire apparatus of this conservation model. His knowledge, built over 14 years, is the bridge between the wild and the human, between the gorilla's world and ours. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the animal who charged did not harm anyone. Not because he could not. The capacity for harm was absolute and present in that clearing. A silverback gorilla who decided to follow through on a display charge would produce outcomes that no human being in his immediate vicinity could prevent or meaningfully resist. The stopping of the charge was not the result of human strength or speed or any technical intervention. It was the result of communication, imperfect, cross-species, operating in a compressed and terrifying moment, but communication nonetheless. Moses communicated something to that gorilla, and the gorilla understood enough of it to stop. What gorillas communicate to each other and what they are able to understand from human behavior is an area of ongoing scientific inquiry that produces results that continue to surprise researchers. Gorillas are highly intelligent, intensely social animals with complex emotional lives, long memories, and the capacity for individual relationships. They recognize faces. They have demonstrated what can reasonably be described as grief. They play. They form preferences. The juveniles in the Rushagora family that were chasing each other through the undergrowth that morning were doing something that looked from every external angle exactly like what it was, playing. Not foraging behavior that resembles play, not an instinctive preparatory sequence for a future skill, playing. For the experience of playing, because it is enjoyable, because it is what young animals who are secure and fed and watched over by a powerful protective adult do. The habituation process that made that morning's encounter possible, that allowed a group of 8 humans to sit in the presence of a gorilla family for an hour, works precisely because gorillas are capable of making individual-level distinctions. They can learn, over time, that these particular beings who appear consistently in their territory are not threats. That process of learning is not simple conditioning. It reflects something more nuanced about how these animals understand and categorize their world. And yet that understanding has limits, as the morning's charge demonstrated. A sudden movement, an unexpected noise, a disruption to the expected behavior of the visitors. And the Silverback's assessment shifted from tolerated presence to potential threat with the speed of a reflex. That is the paradox at the center of gorilla trekking. The habituation that makes the encounter possible also creates a false sense of security that can be deadly. The gorillas are not pets. They are not performers. They are not creatures that have been trained to behave in a particular way. They are wild animals living wild lives in their own habitat, and human beings are visitors in that habitat. Visitors who are tolerated because of years of patient work and maintained because of ongoing respectful behavior. The line is always there. It does not become visible until someone crosses it. The juvenile who bounded out of the undergrowth and startled the visitor was not being malicious. Juveniles explore. They are curious, energetic, and not yet fully socialized into the careful behavioral patterns of adult gorillas. The visitor who stepped backward and collided with his daughter was not being careless. The instinct to recoil from a large, fast-moving animal appearing suddenly at your feet is one of the deepest and most automatic responses in the human nervous system. Neither of these events was preventable by the people involved. What was preventable, or more precisely, what was manageable, was the response to them. And that management fell entirely to Moses. The weeks after the incident produced the kind of reflections that high-intensity experiences tend to generate. Several members of the group wrote about it, or spoke about it, in ways that circled back again and again to the same central image: Moses, still, while everything else moved. The German couple said in their account of the trip that they had always intellectually understood that their guide was important, the way you understand that the person flying your plane is important, as a category of importance, as a professional function. What the charge produced in them was a different kind of understanding. The specific, irreducible, personal understanding that a particular human being, with a particular set of skills and a particular quality of nerve, was the reason they were standing upright and unharmed when the Silverback turned away. The wildlife photographer, whose work has taken him to places where frightening animal encounters are occupational reality rather than exceptional event, said something more specific. He said that what he noticed in Moses during the charge was the absence of the thing that most people have in such moments. The absence of the overwhelming instinctive signal that says run, or fall, or make yourself very small in any way that reduces exposure to the incoming threat. He said that Moses, in that moment, seemed to operate from a different instruction set entirely. Not the absence of fear. He did not claim that, and Moses himself, when asked, does not claim it. But a fear that did not determine the response. A fear that was present and acknowledged, and then set aside in favor of the response that the situation required. That capacity, to feel the fear and act correctly anyway, is what experience in dangerous environments produces in the people who survive them long enough to develop expertise. It is not bravado. Bravado is the performance of fearlessness, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more dangerous. Bravado in the presence of a charging silverback produces the wrong response, a challenge, a counter-display, a behavior that reads as aggression rather than submission. What Moses demonstrated was the opposite of bravado. It was a form of controlled deference, the correct deference, delivered with precision at the exact moment it was needed. The forest absorbed the morning, and the group made their way back down the slope toward the park boundary. The mud was still there, the nettles were still there, the roots that waited in the leaf litter for inattentive boots were still there. None of it seemed particularly significant after the clearing. The German couple held hands on the descent, in the way people hold hands when they have been reminded of something. The teenager, who had been quiet since the clearing, walked behind her father with a look on her face that her parents described later as the look she had had as a very small child when she encountered something too large for the words she had. Moses walked at the front. Occasionally he would stop and point something out, a bird, a plant, a patch of bark that held meaning he could read and others could not. He was not performing cheerfulness. He was simply present in his forest, in the way that he always was, in the way that 14 years of deep familiarity with a place produces in a person. At the edge of the park, where the trail opened onto the dirt road that led back to the visitor center, the group stopped. Several of them tried to express something to Moses. The photographer extended his hand and held Moses's forearm for a moment, not shaking it, just holding it, which seemed to communicate something more specific than a handshake could manage. The American father, who had been a man of several words across the morning and the descent, found something like the right ones and said them. Moses received all of this with the equanimity of a person who has long since made his peace with the weight of the job. He told them something that morning before they parted. He told them that the Silverback had not been angry. He was clear on this distinction. Angry, Moses said, is different. What they had seen was authority. What they had seen was a male doing the thing that his entire biology and his entire social role required of him, making certain that the world understood where the boundaries were. The charge was not an attack, it was a statement. And the correct response to a statement is to listen, and to answer in the appropriate language, and not to run. A Silverback does not need you to be afraid of him, Moses said. He already knows you should be. What he needs is to know that you understand who is in charge. The Rushagura family moved deeper into the forest as the afternoon came on. The Silverback led them through the vegetation with the unhurried authority of a being entirely at home in his world, untroubled by the morning's episode, his family intact around him. The juveniles continued to chase each other. The nursing female continued to nurse. The old female, with her methodical consumption of vegetation, was already at work on a new stalk. The forest reassembled its sounds around them. The birds returned. The insects resumed their business. The rain that had been building on the ridgeline finally arrived and moved through the canopy in waves, and the family sat in it and ignored it, the way you ignore weather when you have lived inside it your whole life. Somewhere below, 8 people were riding back toward the town of Buhoma in a vehicle, and none of them were speaking, and the silence was entirely different from the silence that had preceded the charge. This silence was full. It was the silence of people carrying something they had not had when they woke up that morning. The mountain gorilla is a creature that has survived the end of the world as it knew it, the destruction of its habitat, the collapse of its populations, the chain of catastrophes that human expansion brings to every wild place it touches. It has survived because of biology, because of the particular toughness and adaptability of the individuals that made it through, and because, in relatively recent history, some human beings decided that the survival of this animal was worth prioritizing in practical and financial and political terms. That decision is not guaranteed to hold. Conservation is never a destination reached and maintained without effort. It is a daily practice, a daily set of choices, a daily negotiation between competing demands on land and resources and attention. Moses goes back into that forest every day that the schedule requires. He reads the signs, follows the tracks, manages the groups, stands between the wild and the human in the most literal way that a person can occupy that position. Sometimes the work is quiet and the family is accessible, and the gorillas are doing the things gorillas do in the middle of an ordinary day, and the visitors leave changed in the ways that watching wild animals in their own habitat reliably changes people. Sometimes the morning produces 9 seconds that rearrange everything. Either way, he goes back. The Silverback, somewhere in the green dark of the forest, is doing what he has always done, watching over his family, feeding, moving through his territory with the confidence of something that has inhabited this earth far longer than any of the anxious, upright, underfurred primates who come to watch him, and who sometimes need reminding that in this forest, on this hillside, in this ancient